Happy Monday, everybody, to Chaps Mini Cultures. What day is it today? You know this fella? Well, we'll talk about him and some other fellows as well. Let's talk about discoveries and things that need yet discovering. Let's talk about that next.
I found a thing.
You found a thing? What did you find?
Lots of stuff.
Lots of stuff. Welcome, Brett. Welcome, world. Hope you discovered our broadcast time like we discovered it for ourselves just a minute ago. And we're happy to announce to the world that we discovered this thing. It's called video streaming. No, if you live in North America, specifically in the United States, or if you're familiar with the United States, then it may be within your awareness that in the US today, many of the states have a public holiday that is commemorating an Italian sailor who supposedly found a thing. Not sure if he was the person who found it, but let's talk about it. So there's a national holiday. Not every state is observing Columbus Day, are they, Brett? Well, what is it like in Illinois where you live?
Yeah, we observe it here. Kids are off school. Certainly taking the holiday for sure. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, same here. Georgia, they don't have school, but they call it fall break. They don't make it a thing about Columbus Day. And some communities in the US have really taken a hard look at the name on this holiday, and they have revamped it into Indigenous Peoples Day or other reframes of the holiday that used to be singularly, that's a tough word for a non-native speaker, exclusively for a European who managed to wrangle money from the Spanish crown in order to buy some ships and hire some men to travel across the big water in hopes of finding a new passage to Asia, to India, and essentially China, which in the late 1400s was the richest and most prosperous and most powerful country in the world. So it was imperative for these Europeans to find a way to deal with him. And Eureka, he found a thing, and he found an island in the Caribbean that he called Hispaniola. I'm not really sure what the native people of the island called it. None of them are alive today to tell us what they called the island. So this is why this holiday is a bit, at least for me, it's a bit challenging. How do you feel about it?
Yes, in Australia we would say it's got a few hairs on it. It's taken on a bit of a life of its own, and as all discovery and exploration stories might do, and especially if a country depends on its historical framework to continue that narrative, that story that goes on. Now, of course, the Indigenous people existed before Columbus came along. He didn't really discover them. They really discovered themselves. They were quite aware of themselves beforehand. And of course, there is a little bit of a sarcasm in that. But this really does bring to mind a lot of aspects of how do we tell stories? How do we reflect on what we're taught in school and continue that forward? Of course, we would hope that school becomes a place where we learn how to think, not what to think, and therefore that when we hear these stories, we kind of every now and again we stop, take a bit of an assessment, and really, especially when we can now have the access to learn from Indigenous communities and hear from their stories. And discover that these stories that are perpetuated have an effect on the psyche of the community around them that have existed for thousands and thousands of years before other colonial explorations came along.
And the narratives also have an impact on those who perpetuate them, right? So it's an old adage, I guess, to say that the winners, the victors in any battle of societies get to write the history. They get to determine what is the narrative. And for 500 years almost, the narrative has been that Columbus discovered the New World and the Europeans brought civilization to the Americas. And to be quite honest, the way that I was brought up, a child of the 1970s and 80s, the narratives that I received as a student through media consumption, books and movies and whatnot, comics, for me, that narrative was the same. It was that Europeans went elsewhere and made that elsewhere a better place just by showing up. And it took until my adulthood, way into my adulthood, when I got exposed to other information that was either not at my disposal or that I had no desire of finding up until then, that I learned, wait a second, it isn't necessarily so. And how many people today, is my question, are still hanging on to overcome false narratives that paint an incomplete, I'm not saying a false picture, but that paint an incomplete picture of what our past must have been like. For me, I mean, growing up as a German, for me, the image of North America was this of the Wild West, right? Of white European settlers and natives. Back then, we still called them Indians. Forgive me for using that term. And they were in battle with each other, and it was often displayed in a way that we wanted the Europeans to prevail in these combats. And I didn't even question the presence of horses. It wasn't until in my 30s that I read a book which brought it to my awareness that there had not been any horses in the Americas before the Europeans brought them over. Like there hadn't been many things, that chickenpox, for example,
Right.
that brought over. Sorry, I went there. So if this is something that is new to you, or that you do want to delve into a little deeper, this is the book that I recommend to everybody who wants to know, or actually, I don't care if you want to know, read that book. It's let me remove this other thing here. This gentleman is called Charles Mann, and he wrote a book several years ago called 1491. And you're thinking, oh, wow, why is it 91? Was it 92 when Columbus came and found this thing? Yeah, but this book is about the time before Columbus came. What were the Americas like before the Columbian, let's say, conquest? Maybe that may be a more accurate term. And that was a very enlightening book for me. Very enlightening book.
Well, and there are plenty of narratives, plenty of stories, plenty of actual factual things that have been written, and they can be discovered. But obviously, if you have to go looking for them sometimes, so that's the point about taking stock and being curious about the origins, and not from a position. You can stop yourself doing it and say, well, it's safe now. I've got the story. I can tell myself a story. It's safe, and I can call it heritage, and I can call it whatever it is to make me comfortable. But these stories will make you uncomfortable, and therefore that's the point. The point is that you change, you get some facts, and you change your perspective about what has influenced the land that you're on. And that's why in my country of Australia, we hopefully, as much as we can, honor the land in which we are really guests, and in a civilization that is the longest continuing civilization on the face of the planet. It should be honored. We're talking about tens and thousands of years, as opposed to 250 years in which we tell our story. Now, it might be convenient to tell that 250-year story, and it might be safe, but it really doesn't expand the mind. It doesn't give you, and of course, I think it's a rich knowledge. I just think it's wonderful. The more you know.
And in these conversations, it's easy to make that turn, or being pulled into that cul-de-sac. It's not a through street; it's a cul-de-sac. Trust me, where there is this label thrown around, which has become abundant recently. This label of cancel culture, as if by promoting a different narrative, I was out to cancel the established narrative.
Mm.
Which is not what this is about, folks. This is about adding texture, adding perspective. Another book that might be helpful for a lot of people in the US is Howard Zinn's um, American History. Very controversial to some people, and mostly to those people who are hell-bent on holding on to their singular narrative that makes them so comfortable. I recently had the privilege of presenting to an organization about my personal cultural heritage, which is, yes, German, and more precisely Bavarian, which is a pocket in Germany in the southeast. And the reason why I was invited to do that, because it was about the language, the dialect that we speak, and so forth. And in doing so, I made it a point that tribal ancestry is not homogenous. And chances are, if you cannot trace your heritage back for a couple of thousand years and have a clean delineation of where your ancestors are from, chances are your ancestry is not clean cut as well. My people are a Germanic European mutt with strong Latin influences. However, we are quite hybridical in the way that we came about over hundreds and hundreds of years of history. And there are multiple narratives that lead into my people's story, as there are many different narratives leading into US story, Australian story, and you tell me any other culture around the world, there might be more than one storyline that truly captures the depth and the breadth of a culture. And that's why I'm at odds with the name this day carries in the United States, because the way it was originally designed, it annihilated all the other narratives, right? It didn't allow for a different point of view.
Right. And that's the point, is that in many cases, and the same thing happened in slavery here in the US, it's you told the story about able to trace your family roots back to an origin story of some sort. And of course, DNA is the DNA exploration is something that is offered by companies. And so you get a picture of knowing where you're from, and you can trace through records historical lineage back to a story. You know, there are cultures in this world that don't have that privilege. They do. The conquest, the people who conquered and came and wiped that history out, wiped the history out for a reason, and to dehumanize these people, to separate them, and so therefore there's a whole group of people that do not have the ability to trace their lineage back to anywhere. So therefore, are kind of, you know, there is a start point that is very recent, and that anything we can do to help them discover, maybe in some way, shape, or form, if not direct lineage, but a story of the lineage that existed before the current structure came into place, is really the work that we should all be doing, just through just sheer fairness.
Well, and as people like you and I can help people explore these discoveries, right? To enter onto these journeys, right? I often see myself as not the storyteller, yes, to a certain degree as well. Yet I encourage people that I work with to go on their journey, because they need to make their discoveries for themselves. It's nice to listen to the different stories I can tell. I suspect it's nice for some people. Who knows? Feedback's been good lately. However, I think it's more important to allow others to develop a curiosity about these different discoveries. There is not just the one that you learned in school, or that was presented to you in a certain way. That may have its validity, and I'm not shaking the percentage of truth in it. That's not my job. I see my job in inviting you to look at the other stories that you may have missed. And once you find them, you'll recognize that the picture they create is much richer and much more nuanced, and it will help you come to terms with some of the, I'm using a big word now, with the idiosyncrasies of life and life across cultures.
Absolutely. Well said. I think that's fantastic.
And while I'm at it, because I didn't find the picture, but I found the book on my shelf. I'm not getting paid by this author, just making sure that I haven't read it yet either. But there was a follow-up book to 1491. It's called 1493. And it's called Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. So they're talking about the Columbian exchange, not so much the Columbian discovery. And what they mean by the Columbian exchange is without establishing the trade routes that followed after Columbus. Columbus did his thing, sure, but there was a Spanish sailor that came after him. I have to look him up. His name was Legazpi. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He was the one that a couple of decades after Columbus actually found the path from the Atlantic into the Pacific. And he was the one that is responsible for founding the city of Manila in the Philippines. And so without the Columbian exchange, there would be no tomatoes in Italy. There would be no horses in the Americas. There would be no cockroaches outside of North America. And there would be, I think, bees and certain insects that pollinate were not there on every continent, right? So what happened 500 years ago changed not just the way people look and how people interact with each other. It changed our ecosystems. It changed our trade. It changed a lot of things. So not all of what Columbus did was bad. He is simply the name attached to a narrative that led to hell for a lot of people from Africa and the native peoples of the Americas and as well as South Asia. However, it also changed the fabric of the world, and it changed it, or it laid the foundation for what we live in now, a very interconnected globe that has the ability to communicate this way with each other. And we've begun 500 years ago, we've begun taking an interest in each other and learning about each other, and the journey's not finished, hence our work, right, Brett?
Absolutely. Yes, the journey is never ended. It's a fun journey too. And we have to talk about camels in Australia one time too.
How did they get them? Who brought those? The British brought them from India, or?
Well, this is the thing, and of course the outback is a very inhospitable place, and it calls upon the resources of an animal that can possibly exist in those very sparse environments. And of course, the camels were not only the camels were bought, but the skillful cameleers that came along, and these are the Muslim Afghan tribes that were bought there and expanded, contributed to the expansion and the connectedness of the outback of Australia to this day. It wouldn't exist without them. So these are stories, very small, intricate stories around the world that, yes, it brings benefit. It brings certain benefits. But of course, we always acknowledge that there were people there before, and the reason we learned about the people in these remote parts of the world, the reason we learned about the indigenous societies and discovered their beauty and their wonder was through the expansion of this. Now, the effect after that probably wasn't good on them. It definitely wasn't, and that needs to be accounted for. But there is a good balance. I think there's always got to be a good balance between the benefit of exploration. We should explore, we should inquire, we should push our boat off the shore, we should expand our boundaries, but always be respectful of the people that you are impacting when you do these discoveries. And if you are impacting, if you find there are people there that are going to be impacting, ask them, right? Your perception of your impact on them may not be anything that like their perception of what they see. So it's always really good to look at that. So that's just that's a bit of advice. I mean, for what it's worth, that and $1.80 buys a cup of coffee, as I always say.
Thank you. I'll take it. Can I trade that into a beer? It's that time of day.
It is that time of day. It is late in the afternoon. Yes. Very good. And
All right.
you will notice I have I'm here at the floor coming live from the CETA USA National Virtual Conference 2020. You see, I'm looking down at the floor here.
There's a bunch of people there. We better join them.
There's a few people. We should go back there, and maybe they might serve us a beer. How about that?
Let's discover what they have for us.
Let's discover. Thanks, everybody, for joining. It's been wonderful again, and we will see you, no doubt, sometime tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye.